In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to make a cup using a template by rolling a slab. So first I'm going to start with some pre-wedged clay, and since I have a template that is kind of larger and longer, I'm going to want to get the clay kind of a little thinner so that I can roll it out longer. Alright, so for this I'm only going to use one ruler width, because if you have too thick of a cup, it's kind of hard to use. We want to be thinking about functionality when we work with cups. So I'm going to roll this out real quick. What's really great about using templates is you can see how big your cup is going to be before you make it. So this is roughly the diameter of my cup, and then about how deep it is. So it's a pretty average mug size. Very functional for the amount of coffee I drink. So I'm going to smooth out my slab, and then we'll be able to cut that out. Once we have our slab cut out, we want to make sure we have nice smooth edges, especially if you plan to drink out of it. That's a very important part of this process. And we just want to let this clay set up a little bit so that's a little more stiff. That way it's going to hold its shape a little better and won't be quite as likely to collapse on itself when we start to shape it into the cup form. But what we can do while we're waiting is to create a beveled edge on the two sides of the cup that we're going to be attaching. Because if we were to fold this over and just attach the two edges by overlapping them, you're going to have one spot on the cup that's really thick, and it's not going to look very good. So what we're going to do is make a 45-degree angle cut on opposite sides. That way the two pieces fit together really nicely. So I will start that right now while we're waiting. So as you can see, there's a 45-degree angle on this cut. Then when we move to the other side, we need to cut it going the opposite direction. So I won't cut it this way, I have to flip it over to cut it at that same angle. So I need to be really careful when I flip it so that it doesn't warp. Remember, the less you handle the clay, the better it is. So I'm just going to smooth this out real quick. And I'm going to cut my 45-degree angle the same way I did the first one. So it will be essentially the opposite of what we had on the first cut. You'll notice how I don't cut all the way through on the first cut. I do about 3 slices. That way I know I'm not going to warp my clay quite as much because there isn't as much drag happening. So I'm going to reshape my cut where it kind of distorted a little bit. And now, as you can see, here we have the 45-degree bevel, and then underneath there's a 45-degree bevel. So when we pull these two together, they're going to meet in the correct way. I'm going to be showing you a couple different ways to do a cup. So the first way would be the most basic, just like a plain cylinder mug. Now that we have our bevels put in, what I'm going to do right away is to score up these edges. When you score, you want to think about it like Velcro, so the rougher it is, the more likely it's going to stick. You just don't want to score so much that you destroy the bevel, so rough it up without being too destructive. So I'll flip this over really gently. You want to make sure you aren't pinching the clay or anything so that it moves out of its shape or distorts in any way. So I'll score this side. And when you're working with clay that's still pretty plastic, it's really important when you put this stuff together to make sure you aren't pinching it together, because if you pinch it, it's going to get really thin, and that's going to make it very fragile and uneven. So we want to put this together in a way that we don't thin it out any. What we're going to do is smooth it sideways. We aren't going to pinch it together. Just smooth it off to the side. That should keep it all the same thickness. So what I'm going to do is lift up this slab very gently onto its side and then form it into the cylinder that, or the shape that I want it to be, which is just a plain cylinder. At this point you can do changes to it. And since my clay is still so plastic, I'm going to not use any slip. If your clay is a little bit harder, if it's getting a little closer to being leather hard, then you're going to need slip to put it together. But at this point, it's so wet, it will stick to itself. So remember, we're not pinching the clay, we're just pushing it off to the side, so following the direction it's going. So we see how nicely that bevel fits our clay together. It's almost like it's a continuous loop. So I'm just very gently going to support the inside of the cup with my one hand while I slightly, just very gently, smear the clay off to this side. So I am not pushing anything on the inside of the cylinder here. I'm just supporting it so that it doesn't move inwards. And then I can work on smoothing out this shape a little bit more as I go along. And at this point, it's super important that we're just being very gentle with this shape, because remember, the more you move around with stuff, the more warped and out of shape it becomes, and more likely it is for it to crack. So now we need to smooth the inside of our cup. So again, I'm just going to support the clay with my hand on the opposite side, and then very gently just smooth the clay over. Now, this smoothing really works best when your clay is still quite plastic. If your clay is starting to get harder, this is going to be a little more difficult. And if your cup is too big for you to reach your hand in, if it's too deep, you're going to need to use a modeling tool to kind of extend your reach. And you can use a rib to smooth out your clay too, but you also want to be careful that you don't gouge into it. So this is just a very gentle procedure. Now I'm going to let this one set up a little bit before we put a bottom on it, and we will talk about the second way that we can make a cup, and that would be using darts. So we're going to do this exact same thing over again, but then we're going to add another step. If you want your cup to kind of curve inwards a little more so that it's not just straight up and down like a plain cylinder, you're going to need to do something to bring in the edges. And I'm going to be using a little sewing term, something called a dart. So a dart is, you know, if you think of like a fitted shirt or something, there's usually those panels that kind of come in around the waistline, and that kind of helps trim up the figure to make it a little more fitted. So we're basically going to be using that same concept with this clay. So in order to make a dart, what you need to do is trim up the edges in 4 equally spaced areas. So we'll use a butter knife to kind of find those areas. To create a dart, what you need to do is kind of find an equidistant edge and make a little mark. So my cup is just a little big for my knife, so I just made a little tick mark. So I have 2 edges that are equally spaced. Now I'm going to go the opposite direction, and I want them to be as close to equal as possible. So just like you'd be making a cross right in the middle of this. So you're dividing it in half, one direction and then the other direction. Now, when you make your dart, you're going to cut out a V into your cup. And depending on how large the V is, the dart will be more or less drastic. So if you only want it to come in just a little bit, then you're going to make a small V. So a small one. If you want it to be a lot more drastic, you're going to make a bigger V. So just depending on how much you want it to go in. Just keep in mind that the bottom of your cup, the smaller that base gets, the less sturdy it is. So you want to make sure that you are keeping that in mind when you're making your base. So obviously a base that's this wide is going to be quite sturdy because it's really wide. But if we make a circle that's only about this big, it might get a little wobbly. So just be thinking about that when you're working on your darts. Now, when we do this, we want to make sure that our darts are equally spaced. So just like we did here, and we'll do the same thing over here, same size. You want to keep it the same size throughout because otherwise it might make it a little wobbly if it's not. So as you can see, I'm not cutting all the way through. I am just marking where it's going to go. Now when I do make the actual cuts for the V's, I'm only going to do one at a time, and I'm going to attach them all together one at a time, because if I cut all the V's out, my cup might get a little unstable and it might fall apart. So to err on the side of caution, we want to just do one thing at a time. So I'll make my first cut over here. I'm going to just make a little mark where my point of my V is going to be. It's going to go straight down from the center. And before I cut, I want to just draw a little line here so that I know where my cut is going to go. And then to keep my cup from warping, I'm going to just slowly cut into it. Otherwise you're going to pull the clay, and it's likely that it's going to warp out of shape. Okay, so I have my V cut out. Now what I need to do is score, slip, and smear. And my clay is still quite plastic, so I don't want to over wet it by using a lot of slip. I'm just barely going to use any slip here, just kind of dab it on. And I'm going to press this together. And when I smear, just like when we put the cylinder together, you want to be absolutely sure that you're not pinching it when you smear it. Because if you pinch, it's going to get thin and then it's going to be very fragile. So usually I only smear moving in one direction, and that kind of keeps it from falling apart. And then we need to smear going the opposite direction on the inside. So try and keep your movements going in a similar direction, and that's going to help keep it from coming apart. So you might have like a bump like this, and we can worry about kind of pressing that in and shaping it a little later. Because as you can see, if you do it too early, your stuff starts to kind of break apart. If you do have a lot of difficulty and your clay starts to get really thin, what you can do is take a piece of really moist clay and use it kind of like a patch. And that's going to kind of thicken up the area and help keep it together. Alright, once you have one done, you want to move to the opposite side. And remember, the more you squeeze the cup and the more you move the cup around, the more likely you're going to have cracks and have issues with things falling apart. So try and keep from moving it as much as possible. Alright, so I finished making the darts all the way around the cup, so we can kind of see how it moves in now. And when we kind of flip it over so that it's right side up, we'll see that nice taper as it goes in. And at this point, it's just really important that we just not play with this. We get it in the shape we want it and just leave it. So what we're going to do now is just wait for the cup to kind of stiffen up again, just like we're doing with the first one. And once it's getting close to being leather hard, then we will add the bottom to it. Once your clay is hardened up enough that it kind of holds its shape reasonably well without being a little too floppy, then you should be able to put the base onto your cup. What you're going to want to do is roll out a slab, and again you want to let this one sit too just a little bit so that it's a little bit more stiff. That way it's going to be less likely to squish when you start to smear it together. So I've let this sit out for about 15 minutes or so. You may even want to let it sit wrapped overnight to let it stiffen up a little bit. So what I'm going to do to get this going is to just place my cup onto the slab. And since I'll be doing both of these cups, I want to be able to fit both of them on there. And get your cup into the shape that you want it to be, in case if it happened to have gotten knocked out of shape a little bit. And then you're just going to take a needle tool or a knife and just very gently trace right around the edge of your cup. And remember, when you're cutting through something that's relatively thick, you don't want to go all the way through the slab right on your first cut, because that's going to cause some drag and most likely distort your shape that you're cutting out. I'm just going a little bit at a time and cleaning off my needle tool as I go. That way there's less clay in there to create any drag. And always remember, whatever extra clay you have, make sure you keep it covered up so that it doesn't dry out whenever you're not using it. All right, when we are ready to attach, remember we're scoring, slipping, and smearing. So I'm going to make sure everything is the right shape. And we'll put just a little bit of slip on here. It's still pretty moist, so I don't want to use too much. Usually if my slip starts to kind of fill things in, I like to rough it up again before attaching it, just for good measure. And we are ready to attach. So I'm going to kind of give it a little wiggle, make sure it's stuck to the bottom piece, and now comes the smearing part. I want to make sure it's nice and clean, joined between the two pieces. When you're smearing this, you want to make sure that you're not distorting anything. So if you're having a difficult time getting there with your fingers, you can use a modeling tool to kind of assist you. Since the outside is so nice and smooth here, the inside of the cup, mostly what I'm going to do in here is just smooth out that extra slip that we see in there. So nothing too major, mostly just clean up. Because craftsmanship is really an important thing when it comes to making things with clay. So I'm not doing too much in here, I just want to be clean. If I go too far, then I'm going to risk distorting the cup or making it really thin at the base. Alright, so here we have it, your basic cup. I'll talk about handles once we get the other piece put on. At this point, it'd be a really good idea to scratch your name on the bottom. So the same process goes for cups with darts. It's just a little more difficult to get these put together just because sometimes it might be a little uneven where we did our darts. So getting this to be stable and not quite as wobbly is a little bit more challenging sometimes, not all the time, just sometimes. The key thing to making a good cup is having a stable cup. You don't want to be drinking coffee and then your cup falls right over because it doesn't have a stable foot. So the key to doing this really well is to make sure that everything stays nice and flat when you are working on it. So the less you pick it up and move it around, the better, just like most things with clay. You want to be working on it on a flat surface, and that's going to keep it flat. And that's also why I let that slab sit out for a little bit so it started to stiffen up, because then it's less likely to get squished or warped out of place. It's a lot more stable and sturdy. If I wanted to, I could take a paintbrush to smooth out all these extra areas, especially on a shape like this. Since there's darts, there's a little more of an angle as compared to the 90 degrees that we have on the first cup. And when we look here, the base is going to be a little different on this cup as compared to the plain cup. So you'll probably want to use a modeling tool just to get everything smoothed out. If you wanted to, you could even, once it's a little more leather hard, you could take a wire loop tool and kind of carve into this to make it a little more even. That's completely up to you. But when I'm smoothing this, I'm just really making sure not to touch this base. We want it as flat and sturdy as possible. Alright, so that seems pretty good to me.